Welcome to the third update video of the Fog of War Studio construction series. This episode will involve lots of paint. Just to bring you back up to speed, this is what's happening. Fog of War is getting a new studio. It's being built in half of my garden shed. In episode 1 I cleared the shed and had the stud walls and gyprock installed. This was okay, but unfortunately episode 2 covered me struggling with finishing the jointing and sanding of the walls. This stalled the project for about 3 weeks, but family circumstances forced my hand and I had to get the project as far along as I could fairly quickly. In this update we can see how far I got before I ran out of time. Join me for the ride. It's winter here in Australia and the weather wasn't cooperating. With no electrics in the shed at present, I could only work when there was enough light to see by. This slowed things up quite a bit. Luckily there wasn't too much rain. After about 3 weeks I had finished the wall prep work. It's not great. Filling the joints with jointing compound and smoothing it all up looks easy on YouTube, but is much harder in real life. This was compounded by using the wrong tools. My usual pattern was muddle through as best I could with what I had, before giving up and buying the actual tool I needed, like a wide enough palette knife. This is a bit of a hangover from my dad, who couldn't understand why chisels existed when there was already screwdrivers. But the jointing was as done as it was ever going to get, because I needed to get on with the painting. My mother-in-law has dementia and was moving in with us in a couple of weeks, which would stop the project. I wanted to see how far I could get before then. Raw drywall sheeting needs to be sealed before it can be painted. Undercoat isn't enough. A sealer is more than an undercoat. It bonds with the drywall surface to make a solid base for paint to stick to. Improperly sealed gyprock will peel down the track, a problem I've dealt with in several houses I've bought. Solver Maxi Prep is an acrylic undercoat sealer. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I went to the local trade paint supplier and said what's the best thing to use on raw gyprock, and this is what he sold me. 15 litres was about 160 Australian dollars. I ended up buying another 4 litres in the end to finish 2 coats on everything. Here's the result. I didn't film the painting as time was a factor. You can see the wall has 2 coats and the ceiling has 1 at this stage. This was the going and buying some more sealer stage. It took a while to get the hang of this. The sealer is much thicker than paint. You need to use much more paint on the brush and roller than I'm used to. The sealer gets sucked into the drywall paper, so you need a pretty thick coat. Cutting in around the edges with a brush took a whole day. The rollering of the main wall area is about 3 hours for each coat. The sealing took another few hours per coat. But in the end I got good coverage. The paint should have something solid to stick to. Acrylic paints make cleanup a lot easier. I grew up painting with lead-based enamels and cleaning up with thinners and turpentine. I'll take acrylics any day, even if I did end up washing the brushes, roller and tray standing out in the rain a number of times. Next up was time for sealing white. White ceilings help bounce the light and don't give a colour cast when filming. It's important to thoroughly stir paint before you start painting. This mixes up the pigments and other components of the paint to get a consistent finish. In the old days this was always done by hand. In my family often with a stick found on the ground. I bought a fancy paint agitating tool that fits on my new drill. Welcome to the 21st century. Oh brave new hardware store that has such gizmos in it. Again we start with cutting in. This process gets paint into the corners and around edges of windows, doors and fixtures using a brush. Places you can't effectively reach with a roller. It was at this point while I was painting white ceiling paint onto white sealer that the poor light was the most difficult. It was hard to see where I'd been. The trick with cutting in is to not paint too much of the surface with the brush. You just need enough width of paint either side of the corner or edge to cover out to where the roller will reach. It's always less paint than you think. Cutting in takes a lot of time because you need to be careful. This is the finished result. You can't really see the difference in colour on the footage, but it's there. One trick to get an even result is to paint the second coat across the direction of the first. So the walls are sealed and the ceiling is painted. Time for some colour. I'd been so wrapped up in the construction I hadn't decided on a colour scheme. Since it is a video studio, blacks, whites and neutral greys are the best choices. They don't introduce colour casts when reflecting light when filming. Again, we trooped down to the paint store and got wall paint. I went for a darker grey than I'd originally planned, a colour called Storm. As before, the process starts with cutting in. I've used painter's tape to mask the corners but painted the rest of the edges by hand. The trick to get a nice straight edge to the paint where it meets the ceiling is a rolling motion with the brush that forces along a wave of paint ahead of the bristles. It takes a while to learn this technique, but it means you can do sharp, clean edges without masking. My dad taught me to do this and I thought about him a lot during this process. Again, I'm cutting in far more than I really need to here. The roller can come up to within 2 or 3 centimeters of the edge. This is just a bad habit. Speaking of rollers, it's time. The trick is to get enough paint on the roller to get some coverage, but not enough that the paint drips or splatters when rolling. This is just practice. You should just roll in an up and down motion. The idea is to get enough paint on the wall to get solid coverage, then when the roller is getting dry, roll back over the stuff you've just covered. This is called laying off, and it evens out the coverage, feathers the paint edge, and smooths over any thick lines or runs. This gives you a nice, even finish. This is the first coat. It looks pretty good, but once it dried I could see that there were still some patches that needed to be caught by the second coat. This is the finished result. All up it's looking pretty good, better than I was expecting. You can still faintly see the wall and ceiling drywall sheet joins, but not enough to lose any sleep over. The woodwork hasn't been undercoated or painted. That still needs to happen. Plus the electrics need to go in. The old fluoro lights are being replaced by LEDs. We'll see what that looks like. The thing that did arrive just before I finished this video was the acoustic foam panels. These are for the walls and ceilings and stick on using adhesive tabs. The panels don't actually provide any sound insulation. Instead, they cut down the echo and reverb in the room by stopping sound bouncing off the flat wall and ceiling surfaces. This will be handy. You can hear how live the space was in the last update video. These stick-on panels should eliminate this. The panels come vacuum sealed in really compact packs for shipping, but they expand back to their full size once you unpack them. I have 60 of these and a dozen of a different pattern to place around the walls. Too bad it will cover the nice paintwork. Anyway, my deadline has expired. My mother-in-law moved in this week and the studio space is now full of stuff removed from the house to fit her in. But there's enough room for the electricians to get in and fit the lights and power. I'll update you again when there's any progress. Thanks for watching.